There are many Disney films in the modern age that would have left Walt Disney very disappointed with the direction his company has taken. The first few films to come out after his death, however, are another story. Because while it would take Disney a long time to find their footing again after Walt Disney's death, it wasn't for a lack of trying to get back on their feet, especially because for the longest time they did try to do things exactly the way he would have done it. It just so happened that without the man himself at the helm, nobody knew exactly how the Disney magic worked to the point that it required an intense shakeup to get it back. But the fact that those films from the 1970s in particular do have their defenders does speak to the fact that even without Walt Disney to oversee them, his methods could still work. And today, I'd like to take a look at the very first movie released after Walt Disney's death, specifically the Aristocats, and go over how it was the best ode to Disney that the company could give without him. And there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you've been meaning to see this movie and don't want to know how it ends, please feel free to come back after you have watched it. You have been warned. Okay, so as I already explained in great detail in my video on how Walt Disney's style of making movies was different than current day Disney, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description in case you want to check it out, Walt Disney was a man who wanted his stories to focus on the heart, humor, and animation before everything else. He did of course value the story, but the way he saw it, the plot could be born out of those three things rather than the other way around, and a lot of the movies released in his time reflect this. They don't have the tightest stories, and sometimes the plot takes a back seat to the gags, but overall they still work most of the time. For whatever reason, Walt Disney was always able to tell a funny and emotionally fulfilling story even when the plot wasn't his main priority. And because that's the way he always insisted on doing his films, and it was more often than not led to great success, that's exactly what they did with the Aristocats. Now, to be completely fair here, Walt Disney himself actually greenlit the Aristocats to be made before he died, but unlike The Jungle Book, which was basically finished at the time of his death and had his hands all over it, the Aristocats was nothing more than a concept, so the entire movie had to be made without any input from the man himself at all, and the very first time the company ever had to do that. But as I already noted, they did it exactly the way he would have done it. Because while there is most definitely a plot, it's not a very complex one, with there being plenty of humor thrown into the mix pretty much just for the sake of it, has some pretty catchy musical numbers, and is rather heartfelt in places too, all around making for something that Walt Disney would have approved of. But despite that, just like the majority of films released immediately after his death, it appeared to be missing something. Because while nobody will really argue that The Aristocats is a bad movie, as it's most definitely the cute kids movie it's trying to be, it suffers from a few problems that previous movies supervised by Walt Disney didn't. Because for one thing, it arguably appeals a little too much to the kids over adults. Because if there was one thing Walt Disney knew how to do, it was take stuff that on paper looked as though only children could stomach it, and turn it into something that left adults genuinely invested too, and that's something that's missing to a degree from the Aristocats, though not completely. And there's also that the humor can get a little intrusive in places and take over the story a little too much, because as I noted in the aforementioned video, Walt Disney knew when enough was enough concerning the gags of any given scene, and things like the Uncle Waldo scene, though funny, arguably goes on a little too long. And while it has its more emotional moments as well, it just doesn't land quite to the same degree. I mean, it's probably the aspect that comes the closest to replicating Walt Disney's style, but something just isn't there. Because if one were to compare this to, say, 101 Dalmatians, one would definitely admit that that movie has something in the emotional department that the Aristocats doesn't. And there's also things like Edgar, who many would say is one of the weakest villains to come out of Disney before their infamous problem with them arose in the mid-2010s. Because among other things, some actually do feel sorry for him considering he was a loyal butler who was passed over for a fortune in favor of cats. And one does have to admit that can be pretty rough. Though to be completely fair, that doesn't exactly justify the lengths he goes to, especially when one considers all of the emotional distress he puts his mistress through just so he can claim her fortune for himself. And he does act a little arrogant. But the fact that there's any room to pity him at all is a problem. And one thing that few, if any, Disney villains in Walt Disney's time suffered from. And there's also that his defeat is kind of underwhelming, to the point that some would argue that the original ending where he's caught and arrested might have been a more fitting end for him. Seriously, as I noted in my video on Disney villain defeats, which you can also find a link in the description to, the villain's comeuppance is often one of their defining traits, and Edgar hasn't got it. But at the same time, he does have his good points, and considering he might be the weakest part of the film, does speak to how the Aristocats isn't bad so much as reaching for the stars and only making it to the moon, which isn't a bad feat on its own, but kind of disappointing compared to the expectations of the mission. Because when all is said and done, the Aristocats does work. Again, the emotional core is solid enough, even if it can't reach the heights of Disney's best. The plot is a reasonably well done one, and is pretty funny in places. Especially Edgar's run-ins with Napoleon and Lafayette, which may just be his best moments in the film, and perhaps the most hilarious the movie has to offer in general, even if they have almost no bearing on the plot. Seriously, if I could just inject my personal opinion in here for a second, I could probably watch a whole separate movie of Edgar trying to accomplish something only for those two dogs to stop him at every turn, because those scenes are like something out of a Looney Tunes or Tom and Jerry style cartoon, and just as funny as them on top of that. But to stay on topic, the point is that, as I already mentioned, the movie does more or less accomplish everything it sets out to do, and is nothing to be ashamed of. It's just that it lacks something that the movies made under Walt Disney's supervision had, and that's what keeps it from being a Disney classic. And it would be the same story throughout the 1970s, to the point that, as I explained in my video on the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh, which you can also find a link in the description to, they resorted to squeezing 3 previously made Winnie the Pooh shorts together and releasing them as a packaged film in order to recapture some of the Disney magic that had been missing since his death. And it ultimately wouldn't be until about 20 years after he died that they were able to find their footing again by taking things in a different direction. In other words, for a long time the company tried desperately to replicate the Disney magic without Walt Disney himself there to help bring it to life, and as a result was never quite able to capture it until they opted to do things a bit differently. And the Aristocats not only marked the start of that dark period, but was also indicative of what their movies to come would be like, barring exceptions like The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh or The Black Cauldron. But as I noted before, in the end, the Aristocats is nothing to be ashamed of and is ultimately a pretty solid effort considering it was the first movie the company made without its creative director to guide them. And with just how many elements and trademarks of his personal style it contains, probably does make for a pretty effective ode to Walt Disney at that. Again, it isn't perfect by any means, and had he been alive to oversee its production, it probably would have turned out better and had its flaws ironed out. But if this movie contained a dedication to him, and he could have somehow seen it, he probably would have been pretty happy with it overall. But at the same time, it also helps show that the Disney magic was a real thing and that Walt Disney himself had a lot to do with it. Because without him at the helm, it was clear almost immediately that something was missing, and not anything that could be clearly articulated at that. So as I just said, the Aristocats was ultimately a noble effort to honor Walt Disney and to try and continue using his personal style without him, but also showed that the company was not going to be able to recover from his loss quickly or easily either. Alright, that's everything I had to say on that. So now why don't you tell me? Do you believe that the Aristocats was a solid way to honor Walt Disney's legacy and for the most part succeeds at that while still having quite a few flaws? Or do you believe that it's simply a bad movie that foreshadowed just how much the company would suffer without its creator until the Disney Renaissance came along? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below, because as always, you do not have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel any way you'd like about the Aristocats, how much it honored Walt Disney, and his personal style of filmmaking however you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.